I'm Jaime Siegel. I am the global licensing lead for the Open Invention Network. How many people have not heard of the Open Invention Network? Okay, good. All right, I'm going to talk about the journey to open source maturity for financial institutions. Part of that, I'm going to tell you about the Open Invention Network and why it matters, who we are, what we do, and how we help financial institutions on their journey to maturity. So one of the things we know for sure is that as you get into a cycle of technical development and that path towards maturity, meaning commercial use of open source, your risk profile goes up, right? And it can go up a lot. And by a lot, I mean there could be tremendous amounts of dollars involved, both in terms of managing the risk and licensing the risk. And risk is just an unfortunate benefit to success. You've probably all heard of patent trolls or non-practicing entities, and I give a lot of talks to smaller companies, and I always tell them, if you've been approached by a non-practicing entity, congratulations. It means you're probably making money. Because the people that are any good at that don't go after companies that don't make money. So all that risk comes, the more money you make, the more successful you are, there's more risk. So we start out the development of open source. So I always thought it was very interesting in financial services. I had friends that were working as developer consultants back in the 80s, and they were mostly developing Unix-based programs for trading floors and getting paid far more money than anybody I knew in their 20s back in the 80s. And because I knew that, I was actually surprised to see, frankly, how low in terms of relevance to a business plan technology was at financial institutions other than the trading floors until really within the last decade or so, where, I mean, how many companies had OSPOs 10 years ago? Probably none in financial services. And the reality is that technology is a part of everything now, and the businesses are run through technology. So we start off with development of open source, and we're just exploring open source as a new concept. There's nothing like open source. I describe open source as a marriage of technology and culture. And it's that marriage of technology and culture that makes it unlike anything else. That's what makes it so successful too, because it's the cultural component that is so integral to the success and widespread ubiquitousness of open source. And that in turn drives all of your employers and companies to turn to open source as a solution. When early on in open source, and I'll tell you about OIN history, I was a lawyer at Sony for 20 years. And I was there when the consumer electronics industry made a choice to switch from Microsoft embedded to Linux to run consumer electronics products. And the pitch was, the biggest problem with using a proprietary solution, and one of the reasons open source is so successful, is that it wasn't the fact that we had to pay Microsoft, it was the fact that we were subject to their development cycles. And as a company, you need to control your own development cycles. And that's what open source enables, right? Open source enables you to control your own development cycle in a very collaborative way and to leverage other resources around the world, because nobody ever has enough resources, and open source allows you to effectively expand your team to a global team to leverage. So people said, hey, you should switch to Linux, it's free. I said, well, at the time Sony was making about $800 million a year licensing out its intellectual property, and we were paying about $800 million a year out to other people for their intellectual property. So we didn't buy the whole free thing. So we got together with a bunch of other companies and created the Open Invention Network, which I'm going to explain to you, to manage risk. Because one of the things we learned in the consumer electronics industry is that the best way to promote ubiquitousness of a new technology is to clear risk. And if you can clear risk, you're going to pave the way for adoption of new technologies. Because it doesn't matter if you're in technology, ultimately, unless you are a pure technology company, your group is generally penniless and powerless and at the whim of the business units that are driving the revenue. And every dollar you get, you have to scrape and claw for. So if you're able to show a reduction in risk that is going to help drive business, that's great for everybody. So then the next step, we get to adoption of open source solutions. So now you've decided you're going to adopt open source, and you have to start developing programs and your code around open source. But at the same time, in parallel, you should be developing an IP strategy around open source, because open source doesn't necessarily mean free. It just means that it's open source. And that's a big misunderstanding of a lot of folks. That was certainly a misunderstanding when they came to consumer electronics and said it's free. We knew it wasn't free. Nothing's free. So we just had to come up with a strategy to effectively make it free, and that's what we did. But in active IP development, you can look at companies in financial services. TD Bank is one of the more progressive leaders on it. Josh Deeth heads up that group there. He's now the head of innovation at TD Bank. And they were really, at least from our perspective, one of the leaders in technology. And the idea that they have an experienced person leading technology and IP risk is really, I think, a real good feather in their cap. And then you finally get to the commercial use of open source, and now everybody sees what you've been doing. You're developing apps. Shocking how many people I talked to said, oh, we don't use open source. I said, you have an app? They said, yes. I said, well, you use open source. Android is open source, right? And oh, by the way, you're probably also using open source in your HR systems, your logistics systems, your financial systems, and every other system you have in your company, with the exception of where you may be using some specifically proprietary tools. So risk is going up, which means that now you're getting to be a big concern, and you can either get ahead of that risk, or you can be a victim to that risk. And unfortunately, the reality is that a lot of companies, you have to be reactive, not proactive in IP. That's just, I always thought we were more fire people than planners. But if you're lucky enough to be able to have the foresight and to plan, you can plan to get ahead of this risk and manage that risk. And at the end of the day, every company and a business is a competitor to one another. And clearing your risk, is important to maintain a competitive advantage, but at the very least, you don't want to fall behind competitors that are clearing their risk, right? Because that means your costs are going to be higher than your competitors, which makes you non-competitive. So it's all just basic economics in terms of the increase in the risk as we develop open source. So let me tell you about the Open Invention Network and how we address it specifically for the open source community. So we started in 2005. That's when we had that, 2004, I think we had that meeting, and we got together with IBM, Sony, Philips, NEC, Red Hat, and SUSE, which was still Novell at the time. We said, well, let's come up with a solution to address this risk. And at the time, Sony was an expert in patent pools. I was chairman of the board of the biggest patent pool. We licensed video. So every DVD had a license under this gigantic patent pool. And the theory in that patent pool was you had to pay $2. So if you had made a DVD player, you had to pay a $2 royalty, and you get a license from 26 companies of all their patents related to the video codec. And what that allowed is for business units to plan. You could have a 5-year plan now, because we know that we're going to solve 80% of our IP problems for $2. And you can build a plan around that. Well, open source, but the key on MPEG, by the way, was that there's a published standard. So antitrust is always a big concern. The government doesn't like when parties get together and do things together. But in that case, we were able to say there's a standard. We're just going to license patents that are essential to the standard. But we had a problem with open source. Open source doesn't have a standard. That's the point of it being open. I mean, you can get software packages and around, but there's no standard. So what we did is we created this entity with the idea of we were going to have to create a de facto standard to provide licenses to, but we were going to marry with that culture by doing it for free. Well, how are we going to run an organization for free? Well, each one of the board members, they had pretty good foresight in 2005. They each invested $20 million into OIN to create effectively an endowment so we could run this organization and never charge anybody anything. Subsequently, after 2005, we had Google join in 2013 at the board for $20 million, and we had Toyota join in 2017. Toyota is interesting because the auto industry had the same issue that the consumer electronics industry had in 2005. in 2017, if you didn't own the computer in the car, everybody was just going to make a Google car in a different shape and size. So automotive grade Linux started. And Toyota decided, hey, if we're going to push automotive grade Linux and be a leader, we should be a part of the board of this organization, OIN, because we've effectively become, we call it the litmus test of authenticity. So we have over almost 4,000 members now. We grow at an average rate of 43% annual growth rate. And we publish what we call the Linux system definition table. And that's a listing of all the software packages that our licensing program covers. And what's interesting about this is we're on table 12, which means that this table has changed 12 times since we started in 2005, which also makes it very different than a traditional kind of patent pool where we license to MPEG. And that's because open source is constantly changing and evolving. If we kept it frozen in 2005, you wouldn't find a lot of use today with all these developments. So every 18 months we update, and we update by going out to the community to ask for submissions. What software packages do you think are important to include into this standard? Because there's a lot of big benefits that come with getting on that table for our members. So our membership, we have almost the whole world. 157 out of 195 countries have members in Open Invention Network. 20 industries and all 11 sectors in global industry classification standards. 11 of the world's largest open source companies are members. And what's key there, I think we have 7 of the top 10 code contributors are members. And in a minute you'll understand why that's really important. We have the top 6 holders of patent and patent applications in generative AI technologies. And we mentioned generative AI because even though it's not currently completely part of, there's certainly open source components to it, but I would expect we're going to be getting much more active, not necessarily in this group, but in a parallel sister group to focus on AI for the same reasons, to clear risk. Because if you clear risk, you can make adoption more ubiquitous and much faster. So what do we do at OIN? We provide patent protection. For right now, there's 4,500 software packages listed in the Linux system definition. The way we provide patent protection is that every member agrees to provide a free cross-license to every other member under any patents that are essential to those 4,500 Linux system packages. Now, the reality is that out of 4,000 members, I'd say 80% do no development or more, do no development at the low stack. Our license agreement is based on the low stack. We never get above the Dalvik engine. It's 80% of in the kernel and common libraries, and the remaining 20% of the 4,200 or 4,600 packages are in things like programming languages, Kubernetes, really low tools and low middleware. Because we coined this term that we like to call co-opetition. In order for open source to work, there has to be cooperation at the engine, but for the business to work, there has to be competition at the higher stack. And that's where we start to, we don't always, depends on how deep the developer conference is. That doesn't always go over well, the competition part, but that's the business reality. Nobody would have a job today if your companies weren't making money, and you do that by making a better product or a different product than your competitors. And that's just the reality of it. So we're able to bridge this idea of this co-opetition model, but we have to be very careful. So while we have 7 of the top 10 co-contributors are members, which means you're getting a license, if you're a member, you're getting a license to IBM, Huawei, I think NEC, Tencent or Alibaba or Baidu are putting a lot in these days, SUSE, Red Hat, a lot of companies, and you get a free license under all those patents that they have on those low stack. But like I said, most companies don't develop in the low stack, so they don't really, most of your companies probably have nothing, and so you're not giving anything really. What you do give is the commitment that if you ever do get a patent, you agree to the license. But most importantly, what you're giving is participation in our community. And participation in our community doesn't mean you have to send somebody to meetings, because we don't hold meetings. It does mean you can send someone to our technical meetings if you want to participate in the development of the scope of the license. But mostly it just means that you're there. that your name is on a list, and it shows this community growing, because as companies come into this maturity on open source, they're learning, and they're having to learn very quickly. Financial services has a decade lead on a lot of industries now, a lot of industrial companies that think, oh, we don't use open source, but they're learning, well, yeah, you do, and you've got a big problem if you don't get the right people on board to take care of it. We are fine with most of our members not contributing any patents to the community, because it's the growth of the community which also helps change mentality beyond just open source. This idea of co-opetition can really be infectious to a lot of things beyond just open source. The idea that you don't have to be at each other's heads, each other's throats while you're building, that there's a benefit to everybody. Each one of those companies that invested $20 million into OIN was frankly brilliant at the time. How much has IBM sold in servers supporting open source, or Red Hat, or Sony and Philips saved way more than $20 million in license fees to Microsoft and got to take control of their own development cycle. So we do that. So our community is very patent heavy, over 3 million patents and applications across the board. So we're not an anti-patent organization whatsoever. We do things collaboratively in the community, where we help support an open source zone with this company called Unified Patents, which helps knock out weak patents in the space. And we co-invest with IBM, the LF, Microsoft, Meta, Mercedes-Benz. I still pause every time I see Microsoft on the list supporting open source. We got Microsoft to join OIN 5 years ago, and right after they bought GitHub, because they had to make a choice. Developers wouldn't use GitHub if it was the same old Microsoft that was the biggest ogre to open source. So they jumped in with both feet and said, well, we want GitHub to be a success, so not only are we changing our business model, but we're immediately joining OIN, because we're now going from being the biggest villain to being the biggest supporter. So we support key open source projects. I mean, even being here with FINOS, we speak a lot of open source conferences, so we're out meeting people and spreading information and exchanging information. Really important is that because we make no revenue, we have no profit motives, which means we are the proverbial white hat in open source business. And people share information, and that's part of the community aspect. And one of the big benefits of managing risk is the idea that you can get access to our information that we obtain from our community through the daily conversations we have with people. And that helps educate our other members in terms of how to manage specific risks, what risks are out there, how to prepare, how to anticipate, and how to participate in terms of the development of the technology standards so that we make sure that we're giving the best coverage and protection to our community. What else do we do? You'll see in a slide I'm going to show you, one of the things that being in our community does is that you're going to notice pretty clearly that OIM membership definitely has an impact on whether or not you're a target in lawsuits on open source. Whether or not, the data will speak for itself. We can't say that OIM membership caused it, but it's a fact. And we provide regular update newsletters and our bi-monthly information, and that's really key from a risk management perspective, because it's learning about what other companies are dealing with. If they have the guy who was, I can't remember, the Irish guy who was asserting copyright trolls in Europe against everybody for failure to disclose. And we helped a lot of our members to respond to McCarty. And we helped a lot of our members to the point that eventually McCarty went away, because we kept on snowballing our information, right? We become a real good repository for information. So part of that maturity, litigation is increasing. Non-practicing entities, let me just start with that, so I don't buy into the pejoratives or name calling. Non-practicing entity are basically financial investors that make large financial investments to acquire patents and then to license them to generate revenue. Those assets do not come from nowhere. The assets come from industry where companies decide that they're going to monetize assets by selling them. In my consulting business, I regularly act as a broker for major companies buying and selling patents, and I can tell you that a lot of companies are actively selling their intellectual property assets because they're just assets sitting on the balance sheet and you can turn them into money. Like I said, Sony making $800 million a year, I mean, that's real money. That's bigger than most business units. So if we look at the timeline, the cases really started, these are full-blown litigations in open source. There's a lot longer list of people making threatening letters and sending out claim charts and things, but these are the actual litigations that are going on. You see Capital One sued on Node.js by a company, an MPE called Implicit. And then in 1123, Intellectual Ventures, if you're not familiar with Intellectual Ventures, that was a company started by Nathan Myhrvold that owns tens of thousands of patents that they acquired over the last 20 years. They were originally set up as an investment fund. Sony was actually one of the original investors, and the model was they would keep on buying, and if you basically participated as an investor, as new people bought into the licensing program, you would get your investment back. It was a great investment, actually. But now they had all these tens of thousands of patents, and guess what? They turned into an MPE, and they're out asserting these tens of thousands of patents. So in November last year, they sued Liberty Mutual, Comerica, and JP Morgan Chase on patents related to Kubernetes, Docker, Kafka, and Spark. The other company is non-financial services, but you can see that it's increasing. When we go into this year, the lawsuits are continuing, going up to July. Lots of big names, but really not financial services and these targets. But the one thing that really stands out to me here is that not a single OIN member in the financial services community was named in any of these lawsuits. Liberty Mutual just joined about 2 weeks ago, but so they were not a member when they got sued. They are a member now. And we're in discussions with the other companies to join. But this is truly one of those, it's free to join. There's literally no downside to join, only benefits. But I want to show you these are the patents that Intellectual Ventures is suing JP Morgan Chase on. And you can see where they came from. They didn't come from John Smith working in his garage. They came from University of California, AT&T, and a bunch of other companies. These are not solo inventors. And that's because these entities sold their patents to Intellectual Ventures because that's how they monetize their asset. And the technologies that this IV portfolio relates to, Kubernetes, Docker, Apache Kafka, and Apache Spark. And we're going to start to see more and more of these litigations. So how does OIN help with that? Well, we monitor all these litigations. We monitor what's going on. We get approached by many of our members. If you get a letter from one of these companies on open source, first thing that a lot of our members do, they call us up and they said, hey, what do you know about this? Can you help us prepare for this? We want to know what's going on, and we'll do a lot of free work for our members. We'll take a look at the claim charts, we'll give you guidance, we'll let you know who's been sued, what to the best of our knowledge, what we think the results would be, and give you, frankly, a realistic assessment. Is this a real deal or is this not? But remember, while it makes a lot of press when people attack non-practicing entities and say their patents are all invalid, that's just a small microcosm of the patents that are in play. And you only need to lose on one claim of one patent out of everything that's in a lawsuit to lose a lawsuit. So risk management is a regular part of litigation assessment and understanding the risks. So the best way is to just reduce your risks as much as possible for the lowest cost. These are examples of our membership at OIN in the financial services. We've really picked up quite a bit over the last few years. Surprisingly, one of the early signers was UnionPay and Tencent and Ant Financial were three of our really early signers in financial services. Then we got Barclays, was probably the earliest giant bank we had, and Anthem was one of the biggest insurance companies, early insurance companies. And then we've progressed over the last really 5 years with all of these financial companies. BMO just joined about 2 months ago. PNC joined about 2 months ago. NatWest joined about 2 months ago. Bank of America joined last year. The Clearinghouse, which if you're actually at a bank, your bank may be a member of them. The Clearinghouse joined last year. But then we also have companies like Block and Marqeta and Truist and the leading edge technology financial services companies. And again, you don't see any of these companies on the list of companies that were sued by MPEs for open source. So why do companies join? Top 5 reasons. And if anybody wants these slides, please just come scan or I'll scan your badge, and I'm happy to share these deck with you. So number 1 is it reduced patent risks. I mean, there's literally nothing out there that's going to reduce patent risks at 0 cost for you other than an open invention network. That's number 1. Number 2, offers customer and partner protection. That's just basic patent law. You sell a product, you have a license, well, your product's licensed also. So that's great. The one on the left-hand side is actually the most interesting thing, and that came out of a survey from our members, and we did not expect that. Our members have told us membership has enabled them to attract and retain the best developer talent. Because that whole cultural component that we spoke about, for the best developers, they really do care about that culture, and they're only going to go work at entities that are overt supporters of open source. And being a member of OIN is the easiest way to show you're an overt supporter. Best example I can give is that I think New York Magazine or Time Magazine was going to put out an article about companies that were not overt supporters, and in fact seemed like they were pushing open source, but did they have nefarious intentions? And it was specifically referring about Meta. And we sent an advanced copy to Meta, who had been an early member but had dropped out. And within, I think, a couple weeks, Alan Lowe had rejoined OIN because they said, well, we can't have that out there, that we're not support open source because we're not in OIN. So let's fix that. So they joined OIN, rejoined OIN. We provide support and assistance. Different members take different advantage. A lot of members, you sign up and you get our updates, but we never hear back from you again. People that are more active, that want to have a role in dealing with the technology development, as well as if you're involved in any litigation or risk assertions, we hear from those members. So risk mitigation really just needs to be a part of open source maturity as financial services moves. So what should you do? Well, number 1, you should absolutely join OIN, because there's no reason not to join OIN. And you can see that a lot of companies ahead of you have already done a lot of the legwork to, selling free, frankly, is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I almost wish we could charge money for it, because then I can explain it. But free is always, in Japan they say sometimes free is more expensive than paying. And I get that, but the reality is this is a true free, there's no in-app purchases, as they say. So understand what's impacting your industry, right? Make sure you're in the loop and understand what's going on with others in the industry. That's one of the things that OIN does. We make sure that you understand what's going on in the industry in terms of managing risk on open source. Grow your defensive patent portfolio. OIN doesn't do that, but that's something that I personally work with a lot of clients to do, to grow defensive patent portfolios. What does that mean? It means that you're a big company and another big company comes to you and said, hey, here's our patents, we think you need to pay us a license. That's the first meeting. And then in a month when you meet again, you want to have a meeting that says, okay, we looked at your patents, meh. By the way, here's our patents that you infringe. That's a defensive patent portfolio. That gives you a currency in order to offset whatever anybody else wants. And it also can really flip the tables, because if you're a smaller company against a bigger company, well, the smaller company may actually wind up ahead just for balance of payments, right? They just have less to pay on. So building a defensive portfolio is really important and a good way to efficiently build up a portfolio value. Leverage community knowledge, which is what we do at OIN to help enable that. You give us a call, we're going to be your leverage for community knowledge. And membership is an important part to risk management. And that's 28 minutes. So thank you for listening. Any questions? Thanks. Anybody have any questions? Happy to answer any.
Is there just a giant list of patents on the website? Like, come join, get access to these?
No, so we specifically never identify what patents are covered by the cross-license. So the other thing I didn't mention is that you can quit. It's a voluntary organization. You could stay in for as long as you like. And when you quit, you have to give 30 days notice, and when you're out, you're out. And that means that the worst situation would be if we were to say, hey, these 10 Huawei patents are essential to the Linux system definition, and they say, hey, we're out. Then they're sending letters to everybody. Oh, now you're infringing, and OAN has said they're essential patents, so you better just pay. So we don't ever want to create risk for our community, so we don't identify. But what we do know is that you can bet that if IBM has patents on those 4,500 software packages, you could bet that Huawei does, and NEC, the big co-contributors are patenting around that stuff. But like I said, most of our members aren't going to have the patents. I've never had most of my meetings say I'm pretty confident you don't have any patents in the license space, and I've never been proven wrong. Yeah.
What's your process for expanding the system definition?
So every 18 months it goes through an update, and we're supposed to provide 60 days notice, but we typically provide about 6 months notice because it's voluntary. We've only had 5 companies out of 4,000 ever leave. One was Oracle. One was NXP when Qualcomm was going to buy them, and the others were small. So through that process, we hold technical committee meetings, and we're out right now actively soliciting companies to submit what software packages they'd like to be part. We try to, 4,500 doesn't seem like it's so tight, but that's a really tight list of 4,500 software packages. So we only try to include commercially relevant software packages, not early stage projects. So when Toyota joined and paid us $20 million to join, it was another 2 cycles before there were any AGL specific software packages. Because when they joined, AGL wasn't in commercial use, and we don't want to burden everybody with that. So we give a big briefing about what's changed every time in 18 months. You know, to the extent possible, because that just helps feed the community, you know, business, real world and the theoretical world are 2 different things. But there's a lot of information that gets exchanged, and I think most of our members find that the information they get from us is generally very, very helpful. Yeah.
How exactly does Sony make $800 million a year?
Well, this is going back in 2005. We had 60,000 patents, and every VCR, DVD, CD, television was all paying a royalty. I mean, we had a huge patent portfolio, and we actively licensed it. Well, I'm talking 20 years ago, though, right? So we're talking in 05. So in 05, yeah, we were doing probably $700 or $800 million a year in revenue just on licensing. And it was because we spent a lot of money developing these 60,000 global patents on all these technologies that Sony was a leader on. So we went out and we licensed it. Because the reality is that it's not a great business model to have a proprietary solution. There's very few companies that succeed with proprietary solutions. Generally, in order for a product to be successful, you need to have ubiquitous adoption of a technology. So the best example I give is on DVDs. DVDs were developed. There was a transition from CD to DVD, but the problem was that the industry didn't know how to model for it because they knew that patents were going to be a big issue for them. So the biggest patent holders got together and said, hey, we're going to set a price of, I think originally it was $4. So you make a Blu-ray player or a DVD player, you got to pay $4. But remember, back then, they were like $1,000 units, right? So $4 wasn't much of a royalty. It's not like the $30 units. And what that did, the point was to provide certainty. And one of the reasons that patent pool was so successful is that it was never about the money. They didn't get together and say, hey, let's go generate $1 billion in licensing. They said, let's go get together and give certainty to the industry so we can push this technology because we're going to make way more being the leaders manufacturing and selling DVD players and Blu-ray players. And if you look at most successful markets and companies that are the most successful, most of them are doing ubiquitous selling products and services, right? If one company was doing open source, it wouldn't be very successful. But open source is a great example of ubiquity, right? And it's becoming commercially successful in pretty much every industry now. But that means you have to address the risk. And the development community typically has, particularly in open source, hasn't really historically said, hey, let's deal with the business issues. It's only now that it's particularly coming into financial services where it's all about business and managing risk. I mean, that's, everybody in financial services understands managing risk. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you you have a 20% chance of getting sued on open source. But you know what, frankly, even if you had a 1% chance of getting sued and I can clear that risk for free, that's a pretty good calculation. So. I'm in the program. You can look on all the program stuff. I guess I have to give them my presentation, but I'm reachable, Open Invention Network, J. Siegel. Anybody wants my contact or card, I'm happy to share. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.